Hi, everybody. I'm here today with my friend and colleague, Robin Moss, from the other side of the world, so to speak. He's going to introduce himself in the next part of this series about Jewish education in the age of Corona, and also looking forward beyond the pandemic, what we might be thinking about and expecting when we get on the other side. So without further ado, I want to introduce Robin Moss to say a few words about himself, where he works, and what he's up to these days.
Hi, David. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am indeed on the other side, not necessarily of the world, as being an Australian, you should recognize how big the world actually is, but of the pond. As you probably hear from my accent, I'm British. I've lived all my life in the UK, and I work in the British Jewish community. I work for a big Jewish charity, not-for-profit called UJIA, which is the United Jewish Israel Appeal. What we do is we do Israel both philanthropically and educationally. And what I do is I'm the director of strategy. So I hopefully, try and guide us forward to the future, which is an interesting proposition at the moment, but also I head our program. So all of the educational work that we do, engaging primarily, though not exclusively, young people in the UK with Israel. And it's a pleasure to be here, even though in both of these situations, it's very strange. We're not doing this from a studio. I'm doing it from my bedroom and you're doing it from your lounge.
So I want to get into some of the real practical stuff of what you're doing. But before we get there, I do want to ask you a question at a bit of a 30,000-foot level in terms of education and Jewish education. And for you, as an experienced educator, also, I would add here an informal Jewish educator, or you can explain the difference there. What do you see as the purpose of Jewish education? What are the outcomes you're really trying to achieve in the work that you do?
Cool. So as you say, I would classify myself as within the field of Jewish and Zionist informal education. I grew up through the youth movements, which are very, very strong in the UK as they are in Australia. And I would define informal education, first of all, by setting. Primarily, though not exclusively, it operates outside of the formal education system, schools and so on. But actually, in many ways, I would define an informal education very simply by two other distinctions compared to formal. The first is I would define informal education as primarily person-centered and identity-centered rather than content-centered, although content can be a vehicle to create identity. So it focuses on the individual Jew, and the individual Jew becoming who they are, rather than the simple consumption or repetition of knowledge. And the second thing I'd say about informal education is that it's primarily framed quite explicitly in terms of values. So all education is values, includes values, of course. I don't think anyone's naive to not think that, but there's a sense, for example, if you're studying in the academy, at university or somewhere, that what you're doing is the acquisition of pure knowledge. And there are forms of Jewish education or Israel education like that. Informal education is not really there. It has very clearly at its center, different organizations have different values, but a set of values propositions that guide the outcomes of that education. So with that slightly long-winded introduction, what would I say are the aims of Jewish education? I think I would name three. The first is, I think that on the individual level, the aim of Jewish education is to provide all Jews, and define however you want to define Jews, who engage in a Jewish educational process with the opportunity to develop and deepen their connection to Judaism. And Judaism can be tradition, it can be family, it can be language, it can be Israel, it can be lots of things. But the first outcome is if a Jew feels that they are more deeply engaged with Judaism, to put it bluntly. The second, I would say, is on a communal level. I do think there are communal outcomes. I think that one of the aims of Jewish education is to create a generation or continuing generations of Jews who care about Judaism and the continuation of the Jewish people and its continued flourishing, and not in a kind of crass, make more Jewish babies way necessarily, but in a sense of that Judaism is and should be an active force for good in the life of the Jewish and the non-Jewish world. And it's a cliche, but there is only Judaism if there are Jews. The third thing which I would say, and this is perhaps the kind of Zionist in me, which I'm going to lay on the table very simply. I grew up in a Zionist youth movement. I work in Israel education, and I would quite happily hang my hat on the Zionist understanding of the Zionist movement. I would say that a key aim of Jewish education should be to make young Jews, primarily all Jews, but young Jews, feel part of a thing called the Jewish people being more than just a religious group and being more than just a series of practices like a hobby that you do on Saturday morning, but to be a global, but with Israel at its heart, if not its center, people who have a history and a present and a future and some sense of collective destiny. And I think that Jewish peoplehood piece is vitally important as an outcome of Jewish education, because, you know, if you go from the three levels, there's the individual Jew, there's the community, but there's also the Jewish people. And I do think the Jewish people as a collective is an important outcome of Jewish education.
So let me just push you just one bit further on the piece about knowledge and content, because it does interest me as to like, what's the there that you're actually passing on? Because I know you're not saying it's devoid of content, but you are trying to transmit or pass something on from generation to generation. I don't quite think you're saying it's a free-for-all that anybody can end up thinking and doing
Sure.
and knowing whatever they like. So what role does the content or the canon of Jewish tradition and text and wisdom have in your understanding here?
So I definitely do not believe in the free-for-all. I don't think that Jewish content is anything that Jews do or have produced. You know, there are many great Jewish mathematicians, but the Goldbach conjecture is not a piece of Jewish knowledge. It's a piece of mathematical and world and human knowledge that happened to be produced by a Jew, and that's wonderful. So I do believe there are boundaries. I also believe, by the way, that there are boundaries not only in terms of the subject, but also just in terms of like, does that piece of knowledge have some causal link back to, in the very broadest sense, the Jewish tradition, by which I don't necessarily mean just the, you know, the Talmud and the Torah. It's much broader than that, but there's some loosely defined sense of the Jewish tradition. So, for example, there are, again, this might sound a bit facetious, but Christianity came out of Judaism. All of the people who founded Christianity were Jews. I do not consider Christianity to be part of Judaism, even though it links causally back to the Jewish tradition. More practically, what do I think Jewish content is in terms of informal education? I think it partly depends on setting and age and so on, but I think that in the broader sense, and I don't think I'm going to much reinvent the wheel here, I think that there's a Jewish textual tradition that people should at least be aware of and be in conversation with and have the skills to be in conversation with. I think there's Jewish historical, like the story of the Jewish people, the Jewish peoples over the world and over the history, and the role of memory. I think there's a rich set of Jewish ritual practices, some of which are connected to the Jewish religion, but some of which are broader. I think that a connection to the land of Israel and the language of Israel, of the Jewish people, of Hebrew and other Jewish languages, but for me, primarily, I have to say Hebrew, and the land of Israel and the people of Israel, the state of Israel is important. And also Jewish values, the way that Jewish values are played out in the modern world. So I'm not just talking about calling something tikkun olam to make us feel Jewish. I'm talking about a deep engagement with how Judaism has understood the difference between, you know, charity and tzedakah. Charity is about relieving needs. Tzedakah is about bringing about justice. That's a fundamental Jewish idea, that tzedakah comes from tzedek. And therefore, I think a Jew understands the role of volunteering, for example, or should understand it very differently. So that's an example of like Jewish values in a meaningful way, rather than just putting Hebrew words to what we'd be doing anyway.
Right. Look, I mean, there are so many things you've said, and there are many different like rabbit holes, tangents I could go down here. I want to go down the Israel one for a second here, because I think it's possibly one of the differences between mainstream, whatever that means, Jewish education in the United States and mainstream Jewish education in England and also in Australia, where I'm originally from, but not necessarily so. I mean, obviously there are gaps, but does a good Jewish education, so to speak, have to include this strong connection to Israel? And then if you want to, this distinction you've made between Zionist education and Israel education, I think it's a bit more than just semantics here. Maybe just explore that for a bit for our viewers and listeners.
Sure. So absolutely, I think it is a difference in the context in the States and in the UK and in other places. The truth is that I don't know the non-English speaking world so well, but of the rest of the English speaking world, I think that North America does stand out in this respect differently. I would say, like, do I think that there can be a fully formed Jewish identity without a connection to Israel? I think patently the answer is like, yes, because there are groups of Jews who have it and have a fully formed Jewish identity. Who am I to tell some Haredi groups that they are not fully formed, don't have a fully formed Jewish identity, whatever that means? Who am I to tell some of the kind of diasporists, ultra hipster Yiddish revivalist people? Like, who am I? Like, what hubris would it be to me to tell that, well, my Jewish identity is superior because it has Israel as as one of its centers, not the only, but part of its center. I would just say, with a kind of asterisk on that, though, there is a deep irony in many of those groups, which is many of them, like, this is a critique, but I think that there's another side to it. My critique sometimes of those groups would be, they say that they're not interested in Israel, Zionism, and so on, and they just want to develop a separate Jewish entity and spend an awful lot of time talking about and criticizing the rest of us for developing an Israel identity and defining themselves against it, which I'm absolutely fine if people want to, but that is a form of engagement with Israel. So yeah, I'm sure many of your viewers have watched Unorthodox on Netflix, with this young woman who leaves the Haredi community in Williamsburg. She grows up in the Satmar. The Satmar define themselves by anti-Zionism. So I think it's a little bit more complicated than you can have a Jewish identity out of Israel, because the reality is that Israel contains over 40% of the Jewish people and the vast majority of Hebrew language printing and so on and so forth. So most Jews who are engaged in some form of Jewish project will engage with it in some way. But no, I do not think it is the be-all and the end-all. However, I do think more positively, one of the reasons that I think Israel is an exciting and relevant element to Jewish identity and to Jewish education is because I think there's an enormous amount of richness and fun and creativity, as well as angst and complexity and like, you know, the living out of Jewish values for better and sometimes for worse by a Jewish national entity, and questions of sovereignty and power and politics and all of that kind of thing. I think there is a reason that Israel looms very large in Jewish education in many countries. It's because Israel is a large part today of not only conceptually how the Jewish people thinks of itself, but also just in practice where the Jewish people are. And just one thing on your question about Zionist education and Israel education, you know, so the language that UJI uses, as many Israel organizations do in the States as well, is that we do Israel engagement or Israel education. And I'm comfortable with that. I think engaging with or educating about Israel is important. The reason that when I introduce myself, I say I work in Jewish and Zionist informal education, partly is that we're all victims of our own education. And I grew up, my formative Jewish identity experience was through my youth movement, which defined itself in an ideological relationship to Israel and questions of the Jewish people and so on. And that ideological lens was Zionism, as well as liberal Judaism, other forms of Judaism, but in terms of Israel, it was Zionism. And I kind of can't escape that lens even if I wanted to, and I prefer to just be honest about it. But the other thing I would say is that for me, the difference in an Israel education and a Zionist education is that an Israel education, at least in principle, can be dispassionate, can be passive, can be a kind of nice to have on the side of your identity. If you like Israel, you can learn about Israel and you can relate to it like you would to the hotel, as opposed to the home or the homeland. And I do believe, in my view, that Israel is more than just a place where there are lots of Jews that has nice beaches that we currently can't visit because of Corona. I think it is an expression of the Jewish people and of Jewish values and of Jewish identity, as well, by the way, of it being home to a quarter of people who are not Jewish and exploring all sorts of other projects. And I think that an Israel education that does not include some reflection on both the historic role of Zionism and what Zionism means today, for me, is a poorer version of Israel education. So that's why I would say, that's why for me, Zionism is important in this conversation.
Helpful. What about this thing of the Hebrew language? Essential, not essential? Is Hebrew language only for prayer, only for spoken? If you have to make a choice, what would you choose? Should this interview be conducted in Hebrew? Could we do it? Are there enough educators out there who could even teach Hebrew language, even if we wanted to, as an ideological or an educational vision? What's your connection to the Hebrew language and its role in Jewish education?
So this is interesting. So here, actually, I have quite a strong ideological view and quite a strong pragmatic view that are both in complete opposition. So I really do believe that Hebrew is incredibly important, both biblical or Talmudic, whatever, and Ivrit. I think that there will come a time in the not too distant future where the majority of the Jewish people's mother tongue is Ivrit, which I think is an astonishing historical fact, if nothing else, but is also is something to consider just in terms of communication amongst the Jewish people. But also, I do think that the revival of the Hebrew language, even though a bit more complicated than often told in classical Zionist education, was nonetheless the second most impressive thing the Zionist movement did after, of course, founding the state. And I think that as a, not to go teary-eyed, but one of the things I'm often struck by when I'm in Israel is I remember being there during the Tel Aviv Book Festival or whatever you call it, or across Kikar Rabin, there's these lines of tables where you can go and look at the latest books, all of them, almost all of them in the Hebrew language. And one of the things that I really am struck by is that on those tables, in 1 year, at one location, in one place, I think more books new books have been published in Hebrew than were published from the fall of the temple in 70 CE until 1948. Just because you need a body politic who promote Hebrew and ensure it's taught in schools and so on in order to have Hebrew. So I think Hebrew is really important. I think it is not the only and not an essential, but a very, very helpful and really amazing expression of Jewish peoplehood if you can speak it fluently. And therefore, on a conceptual level, I'm completely in favor of it. And yes, maybe we should be doing this podcast in Hebrew.
And here comes the but.
Here's the but. Practically, I have real doubts about the ability of, particularly, again, I can't really speak for the non-English speaking world here, but for the English speaking world to engage deeply in the learning of Hebrew. We are not having this conversation in Hebrew because without casting aspersions in Hebrew, mine is nowhere near good enough to even have quite a basic conversation in Hebrew that's not touristic, certainly not to talk about my work in Hebrew. And that is, I literally am the director of strategy of UJA. I'm in the Israel business and I visit Israel probably 5 times a year. I have many Hebrew speaking friends. I've tried Duolingo, I've tried lots of things. It's very hard for me. In the UK, we have very high penetration of Jewish schooling. There's lots of efforts to teach kids Hebrew. It's really, really challenging. Why? I would put it down to one thing, I have to be honest, which is basically, I can only speak for Britain here, but British middle class values around language education. In the UK, if you're a middle class Brit, forget being a Jew, but if you're a middle class Brit and you come home from school and your book says that you're not doing well at maths or history or English, or science, your parents will be like, that's not good, Robin, that's a real problem. You should do better. We should get you tutoring, or you really need to do better, and that's not okay. And we've got lots of books on the shelf. Why don't we help you? Let's do your homework with you. And if you come home and you're not doing very well at French or German or Spanish or Hebrew, largely the reaction is, well, you can drop it next year. It's not the end of the world. I mean, it'd be nice if you could speak it. I'm not going to stop you, but you speak English, it's okay. The rest of the world is rushing to learn our language. Do we really need to learn theirs? Am I proud of that attitude? No, I'm not. I think actually, frankly, it's an imperialist attitude that comes from the fact that my people sailed around the world and deposited our version of our language and our people around the world, including to both of the countries that you have made home. And we had a rather murky exploits in the Middle East, but let's not even go there. But I think it is a reality. And I think that I have not seen a large-scale intervention that has really worked in an English-speaking country to significantly raise conversational Hebrew. I have more hope for a significant raising of Hebrew fluency in terms of prayer book Hebrew. Many traditionally religious communities, like almost all of their members, certainly their active members, have very good grasp of prayer book Hebrew. But even in those communities, Ivrit has proven to be really, really difficult. So conceptually, absolutely, I'm an ideologue, this should be, this whole conversation, the early Zionists said, Ivri daber Ivrit, Hebrew man, speak Hebrew. That was like a thing they shouted on the streets of Tel Aviv to people speaking Yiddish to each other. I'm all with them. In practice, I'm not confident it could happen.
All right. Fascinating. I am watching the time, so I'm going to ask us to keep some of these shorter questions.
Apologies. Like all educators, I ramble.
No, I do want to ask you a bit about what it's been like as a Jewish educator in England in the time of Corona, what changes you're seeing, how the community is adapting. maybe a bit about the general atmosphere, but particularly in terms of Jewish education over there and what you're beginning to see. And then we'll start focusing more on post-corona world.
Sure. So let me make 5 very brief comments. The first is that Britain has really suffered from the coronavirus. As I speak, we're approaching 20,000 deaths. In fact, we've almost certainly had more, but the way that they count it, it's all backward looking. The British Jewish community has also suffered terribly. We've had over 300 deaths of Jews in the UK. There's only 300,000 Jews in the UK. Just to put it into context, in Israel at the moment, they've had fewer than 200 deaths, and there are 6.5 million Jews there. And again, I know it's the same in New York. Our community is really suffering. It's horrible here. There are funerals all the time by Zoom. It's heartbreaking. The second thing I would say is that, like everywhere in the world, we're all working from home. All of Jewish education has gone online. Everyone's experimenting with Zoom and all of these online tools. Some of it is really inspiring and is getting good audiences and is unlocking creativity. Some of it's a bit naff. The third thing I'd say is this does offer a real opportunity in terms of, I think, like Jewish culture. So, for example, there's now lots of free Israeli films online. There's the flock to Netflix, even more so than before. So actually, there's quite a lot of Jewish culture happening. The fourth thing I'd say, just in terms of Israel education, we have had, like everywhere in the world, to cancel basically all of our travel to Israel programs. That is a devastating blow for me as an ideologue. Like, not being able to send people to Israel is really sad. It's also really problematic financially for the community because the surpluses on those activities typically drive the community, and it's going to, I think, have a huge impact into the future. And then the final thing I was going to say in terms of the community is, it's really, this is going to be a really tough time financially. There are going to be, organizations that collapse, activities that are not restarted. A lot of people will lose their jobs. At the moment in the UK, there's a scheme to pay 80% of the wages of people. That will end at some point, probably at the end of June, it looks like. And at that point, there's going to be mass redundancies, I think. And therefore, the capacity to deliver Israel and Jewish education is going to be challenged. But also, there is resilience in the community, and there will be a new normal. Maybe that's what we'll come on to. There'll have to be. But at the moment, there's a lot of dread and concern amongst the people in the community about their jobs and about what this looks like afterwards.
So before I ask you to be prophet and start predicting that new normal, you might need to translate for our audience here the word naf.
Oh, naf means a bit rubbish, a bit like, so when I say, we've all been on them. There's some, you go onto some of these online platforms and like, whoa, that's really slick and cool and amazing. And some of it's like, nah, didn't really work. The sound wasn't very good. They say it was interactive. It wasn't actually interactive. That's a very British way. That was a bit naff.
All right, gotcha. All right, and put your prophet hat on now. What can you see coming out the other side? Maybe even slant towards the more optimistic version of what could emerge from all of this.
Sure. So first of all, I think there's not another side. I think it's more like it will be an emerging set of realities. This is not like, when there's been wars in Israel, for example, we've had to change our Israel travel programs. The war has ended at some point, and then things pick up. Here, it's going to be a constant set of changes: restrictions imposed, restrictions lifted, economic aid given, and then new schemes and so on and so forth. I think that let me say one thing pessimistically, and then I'll say 2 things optimistically. Pessimistically, I think that social distancing is going to continue for a while yet. I would say at least until the end of 2020 and possibly later. And that means that this thing where we can't gather in person, and online will never replace in person, I don't think, even though there's some very inspiring things going on, but it will never replace it in full, is going to be really, really hard. And if you're the kind of Jewish organization that relies upon gathering in person, be that you run a Jewish summer camp, or you're a Jewish day school, or you're a synagogue, or you organize conferences, it's going to be tough for a long time. Optimistically, firstly, I think that clearly a lot of the trends that were already happening have accelerated, and like life has overtaken what was any inertia. Working from home, use of online tools, mass availability of Jewish education, ability to dip in and dip out. Just on the most basic level, I can go to shul as many times as I like on Friday night. I can spend 10 minutes in each, and I can spend hours going to different shuls. What an amazing opportunity. In theory, it existed before, but in practice, it doesn't really happen now. It really can. The second optimistic thing that I'll say is that I think that the value of community is massively being strengthened at the moment across the world. The sense of isolation is acute for many people, and the sense that there are people out there who care about them, who have shared interests and values is enormous. Mutual help, volunteering, looking out for ourselves, you know, kol Yisrael aravim ze lazer, as well as, by the way, kol kind of kulam aravim ze lazer, all of Israel is one for another, but all of humanity is, that's come back into vogue. We can't be individualists anymore, or at least we will have to be less so. And I think that has great promise to Jewish education because, you know, you can't be a Jew on your own in a desert island. We are a community-based and a collective-based people. And I think that that potentially is a paradigm shift in the, certainly in the individualist West, maybe has a benefit in the long term.
So by now, my listeners are really acutely aware of why I asked Robin to share some insights with us today. But maybe, Robin, you can also just share with us, what's something that you're reading that you would like to bring to the attention of our listeners or watching? What's something that you think people interested in Jewish education should have on their proverbial bookshelf?
Okay, so first, I'm going to give one non-Jewish book and one Jewish book. In terms of a non-Jewish book, and I know that this is like, maybe this is a bit triggering for people and it's the last thing people want to read, but there is a classic work of history called Of Plagues and Peoples by an American historian called McNeill. It was published in the 70s. There are newer versions of it, but it's still well worth a read. It is essentially, it talks about history through epidemiology, through how plagues and bacteria, viruses have shaped peoples. It inverts the normal way we think of history as the works of great men and women and peoples and tribes and nations, and instead says, no, the bacteria are in charge and the viruses, and we are just reacting and being shaped by it, from the fall of the Roman Empire to the conquest of the New World, and so on and so forth. And I think if you want to, at the moment, all of us are like amateur sociologists, like, oh, this is having a huge impact on X and Y, isn't it? And the post-corona world. If you want to see how history in the past was impacted by these things, it's a great book, and it's a really, really well written. And if you want to read one work of professional history, I'd read that. The second, which is much more, has nothing to do with Corona and has much more in our world, is, which I just finished. I just did a reading group with a friend of mine who is British, made Aliyah, now is based in Boston, of a book called Beyond Jewish Identity, which I'm sure, David, you've heard of or possibly read yourself. Beyond Jewish Identity is a collection of essays edited by a series of Jewish academics or Jewish education academics. Oh yeah, oh, you've got your copy too. It's edited by John Levison and Ari Kellner, who are two of the leading Jewish educational thinkers in the world today. One in Boston at Brandeis, and one at I think at Stanford. Yep. And essentially, on one leg, what the book is it is a broadside against a lot of what we've been talking about, which is thinking of Jewish education and Judaism in general in terms of identity, and that we should be strengthening or buttressing or building Jewish identity. And it, for a whole series of reasons, some of which I found more convincing than others, it tries to demolish that picture. And then, most interestingly, perhaps to your viewers or listeners, in the last two chapters, it attempts to build what could replace it. So how might we think of Jewish education beyond Jewish identity? And there's a chapter by John Levison, which is very interesting, where he uses a framework of initiation into Jewish practices. For anyone who's ever done any philosophy, by the way, there's a very famous book by a Catholic philosopher called After Virtue by Alistair McIntyre, where he talks about practices, and it's kind of roughly the same thing, even though Levison's talking a bit differently. And then the very last chapter, which is by Jonathan Wucher, Zichronam Levracha, of blessed memory, died very sadly some months ago, written obviously before his death. He talks about Jewish sensibilities, which is kind of a different way to frame Jewish values, in his view, more palpably and more actionably. For what it's worth, I was pretty convinced by their demolition job and not so convinced by their rebuilding job, but it's a really, really interesting book. It's chapter by chapter, so you can read a little bit at a time. And if you want to know what's going on at the cutting edge of Jewish educational theory and practice, that book would be where I would say you should go.
All right, Robin, one last question that I'm going to ask all of my guests. Give you the opportunity to pay tribute to an educator in your life that made a real impact on who you are and who you became. a brief response to that question, then we'll begin to wrap up.
So I'm going to pick somebody who nobody has ever heard of. I very much doubt he'll ever watch this. I have not met since I was 15 years old, but who totally changed my life. His name is Max Beaver. It's a ridiculous name in many ways, but his name is Max Beaver. Max Beaver was a madrich, a leader, a counselor on my youth movement summer camp. When I was 13, I went. He was my dorm leader, like he was the cabin counselor. Max Beaver was, from my perspective, when he was 19 and I was 13, the coolest person I ever met. He was like so far above anything I could imagine in terms of like would take me seriously, but he did. He cared about me. He listened to me. He made fun of me. He brought me in instead of pushing me away. And the thing that I noticed about Max is, in addition to being the coolest person that a 13-year-old boy could ever know, he was interested in Judaism, and Shabbat was a thing for him. And he took time to do Jewish learning, and he invited us in. And when we had Pulot activities, he didn't just sit on the side and be like, well, the fun bit is the football afterwards. He thought that the football was fun, but actually these big questions of Jewish identity are really important as well. I have not seen him since I was 15 because he went off and did the rest of his life. He graduated from the movement, but he was without question one of the people who changed my life. And if I've got this opportunity and you are listening, Max, thanks, mate. I really appreciate it. And yeah, here's what I've turned out doing. So it worked.
So just because my listeners are who they might be, football also means soccer.
No.
NAF today.
David, football means football. What your listeners think football means is American football, or possibly Aussie rules.
All right, everybody, it's been a real pleasure for me to reconnect and to speak with Robin. I hope you've also enjoyed listening today. We look forward to having many other guests join us in the next couple of weeks. And again, everybody stay healthy, and we do look forward to coming out of this as strong as possible, as resilient as we can on the other side. Thank you very much, Robin.
Thanks, David.